What is the relationship between thought and material existence? Can ideas change the world, or does the world determine our ideas? These fundamental philosophical questions have haunted thinkers for centuries, and they sit at the heart of Marx's philosophical project. Marx famously declared in his theses on Feuerbach that philosophers have only interpreted the world in various ways. The point, however, is to change it. This provocative claim challenged the very purpose of philosophy itself. Yet more than 150 years later, Marx's philosophical insights continue to resonate across disciplines, from economics to cultural theory. Today, we explore the contested terrain where Marx's ideas encounter modern philosophical developments, examining where his thought has been validated, challenged, or transformed by subsequent philosophical inquiry. In this intellectual journey, we'll discover that Marx remains not a static historical figure, but a vital conversation partner in ongoing philosophical debates about reality, knowledge, and social existence. Karl Marx stands as both a philosopher and social theorist whose ideas have profoundly shaped intellectual history. Though often reduced to his economic and political theories, Marx developed a sophisticated philosophical system that continues to challenge and inspire thinkers today. Our analysis examines Marx's philosophical contributions across three foundational domains: his ontology of material reality, his epistemology of socially situated knowledge, and his social philosophy of human relations. We'll evaluate these against developments in phenomenology, analytic philosophy, pragmatism, and post-structuralism. Rather than pursuing political judgments, we seek philosophical clarity by examining key texts and arguments from both Marx and his successors. We'll prioritize primary sources, investigating what Marx actually wrote rather than relying on secondary interpretations. Through this comparative analysis, we'll witness a series of philosophical confrontations that continue to shape our understanding of reality, knowledge, and social existence. These encounters reveal Marx not as a closed philosophical system, but as an open question that modern philosophy continues to address. At the core of Marx's philosophy lies his materialist conception of reality. In the German ideology, Marx and Engels assert, "The premises from which we begin are not arbitrary ones, not dogmas, but real premises from which abstraction can only be made in the imagination. They are the real individuals, their activity, and the material conditions under which they live, both those which they find already existing, and those produced by their activity." This materialist stance directly challenged Hegelian idealism, replacing it with a philosophy grounded in concrete human experience and material conditions. For Marx, consciousness does not determine life, rather life determines consciousness. Our ideas, beliefs, and values emerge from our material circumstances, particularly our involvement in economic production. Modern phenomenology, beginning with Husserl and developed by Merleau-Ponty, would challenge Marx's materialism not by returning to idealism, but by questioning the sharp divide between consciousness and materiality. Merleau-Ponty writes in Phenomenology of Perception, "The world is not what I think, but what I live through. I am open to the world, I have no doubt that I am in communication with it, but I do not possess it. It is inexhaustible." Merleau-Ponty's position both validates and complicates Marx's materialism. Where they agree is in prioritizing lived experience over abstract theorizing. Both reject pure idealism, yet they diverge on the relationship between consciousness and materiality. For Marx, consciousness is determined by material conditions. For phenomenologists, consciousness and materiality are intertwined in embodied experience. We don't just observe the material world, we inhabit it through our perceiving bodies. Herbert Marcuse, in One-Dimensional Man, attempted to reconcile these positions, arguing, "The technological transformation of nature alters the base of domination by gradually replacing personal dependence with dependence on the objective order of things, that is, on economic laws, the market, etc." Marcuse's analysis brings together Marx's materialism with phenomenological attention to lived experience, suggesting that modern technological society creates a material reality that shapes consciousness in ways Marx couldn't have anticipated. More recently, philosophers like Manuel de Landa have developed new materialist approaches that both build upon and challenge Marx's materialism. In A New Philosophy of Society, DeLanda acknowledges Marx's pioneering materialism while integrating insights from complexity theory. Unlike Marx's materialism, in which matter is viewed as a passive receptacle for forms imposed from the outside, the new materialism grants matter an active role. This comparison reveals an important philosophical development. Marx's materialism, while groundbreaking in its opposition to idealism, remained somewhat mechanistic, with material conditions acting upon passive human subjects. Contemporary materialisms, in contrast, recognize greater complexity in material processes themselves and a more dynamic relationship between human agency and material structures. Matter is not just the stage on which human history unfolds, but an active participant in that unfolding, an insight that both extends and transforms Marx's original materialist vision. Marx's philosophical method was dialectical, inherited from Hegel but turned right side up. In the afterword to the second German edition of Capital, Marx explicitly describes his method. My dialectical method is, in its foundations, not only different from the Hegelian, but exactly opposite to it. For Hegel, the process of thinking, which he even transforms into an independent subject under the name of the idea, is the creator of the real world, and the real world is only the external appearance of the idea. With me, the reverse is true. The ideal is nothing but the material world reflected in the mind of man and translated into forms of thought. This dialectical method emphasized contradictions, historical development, and totality. Marx saw social reality as a process driven by internal contradictions rather than a static collection of facts. For him, understanding capitalism required grasping how its internal contradictions generated its historical development and eventual transformation. The development of analytic philosophy in the 20th century introduced logical approaches that sharply questioned dialectical reasoning. Bertrand Russell, in The History of Western Philosophy, directly challenged the Hegelian dialectic that Marx had adapted. The worse your logic, the more interesting the consequences to which it gives rise, and in this respect, Hegel's logic has never been surpassed. Russell's critique typifies the analytic tradition's skepticism toward dialectical reasoning, preferring formal logic and precise language over what they saw as vague metaphysical speculation. This critique appeared devastating, as analytic philosophy became dominant in Anglo-American universities. Yet philosopher Roy Basker's critical realism attempted to rehabilitate dialectics within a rigorous philosophical framework. In Dialectic, The Pulse of Freedom, Basker writes, "Dialectic is the process of conceptual or social conflict, interconnection and change, in which the generation, interpenetration, and clash of oppositions, leading to their transcendence in a fuller or more adequate mode of thought or form of life, plays a key role." Basker's work represents a sophisticated attempt to preserve dialectical thinking while addressing the analytic critique of its logical foundations. Jürgen Habermas, in Theory of Communicative Action, offers another perspective, transforming Marx's dialectical method into intersubjective communication. Marx conceptualized society as a whole in terms of its material base, but he did so from the standpoint of possible social emancipation derived from the normative content of modernity. Today, we must develop a theory of society that integrates the paradigms of the life world and system. Habermas shifts the focus from economic contradictions to communicative processes, arguing that emancipation requires not just material transformation, but rational discourse among free subjects. This methodological divergence reveals a fundamental philosophical tension. Marx's dialectical method captured historical change and contradiction, but sometimes sacrificed logical precision, while analytic approaches gained precision but often at the cost of historical dynamism. Contemporary philosophers increasingly seek methodologies that can incorporate both logical rigor and dialectical insight, recognizing that understanding social reality requires both precise analysis and attention to historical processes, contradictions, and transformations. Marx's approach to knowledge and truth was pragmatic and social. In his Theses on Feuerbach, he famously asserted, "The question whether objective truth can be attributed to human thinking is not a question of theory, but is a practical question. Man must prove the truth, that is, the reality and power, the this-sidedness of his thinking in practice." This position rejected both rationalist confidence in pure reason and empiricist reliance on sense impressions. For Marx, truth emerges through practical engagement with the material world. Knowledge isn't passive reception, but active transformation. John Dewey, in Reconstruction in Philosophy, articulated a position that resonates with Marx's. Ideas are not representations or copies of some prior completed reality, but are plans of action, hypotheses to be tested in the reconstruction of environment. Both Marx and Dewey reject correspondence theories of truth in favour of truth as successful practice. Yet Marx's epistemology introduces a dimension that pragmatism doesn't fully address: the social position of the knower. Marx argued that class position shapes consciousness, that the material conditions of one's existence influence one's conceptual framework. This insight finds an unexpected parallel in Michel Foucault's analysis of power/knowledge. In Power Knowledge, Foucault writes, "Truth isn't outside power or lacking in power. Truth is a thing of this world. It is produced only by virtue of multiple forms of constraint." Foucault's insight broadens Marx's analysis beyond class to include other institutional and discursive forms of power. Theodor Adorno developed Marx's epistemological insights while incorporating critical theory. In Negative Dialectics, Adorno writes, "The need to lend a voice to suffering is a condition of all truth." Adorno highlights that truth cannot be separated from human suffering produced by social contradictions. Contemporary philosopher Miranda Fricker's concept of epistemic injustice further develops this line of thought. She examines how social power affects our status as knowers. When someone is excluded from a practice that would have helped them make sense of their social experiences, they suffer a situated hermeneutical inequality. Marx's key epistemological insight was recognizing that knowledge is neither purely objective nor merely subjective, but emerges from the practical social activity of historically situated human beings. Contemporary philosophy has validated this insight while transforming it, broadening our understanding of how social location shapes knowledge, production and validation. Our philosophical journey through Marx's thought and its modern developments reveals neither simple validation nor refutation, but a complex philosophical dialogue. Marx's materialism has been simultaneously validated by continued philosophical emphasis on concrete experience and transformed by recognition of matter's active properties. His dialectical method has been challenged by analytic philosophy's demand for logical precision yet partially rehabilitated in critical realism and discourse theory. His pragmatic approach to knowledge has been developed in various directions by pragmatists, critical theorists, and feminist epistemologists. The most enduring aspect of Marx's philosophy may be his insistence that philosophy must engage with material reality and human practice. As philosopher Ernst Bloch noted in The Principle of Hope, Marx's thought contains a philosophical program of the unity of theory and practice. This unity remains a challenging but essential philosophical task. If philosophy, as Marx suggested, should not merely interpret the world but change it, then perhaps the most fitting philosophical response to Marx is not to canonize or dismiss his thought, but to engage critically with it, as many modern philosophers continue to do. In this ongoing philosophical conversation, Marx remains not a monument, but a living interlocutor whose questions continue to provoke new answers, and whose answers continue to raise new questions.